No matter who you are or how long you've been painting miniatures, mistakes always happen, and they certainly happen a lot to me. And this is something that can be a little bit disheartening, but you shouldn't let it get you down because it's just a natural part of painting models. In this video, this is exactly what we're going to be talking about. We're going to show you some of the most common mistakes made when painting miniatures and how to fix them as well. Now, if you enjoy what you see here, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell too, so you don't miss out on any future content. And if you really like what you see here, then why not check out DuncanRhodes.com, which is our membership website that's packed full of videos just like this. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the desk. The first common mistake I want to talk about is what to do if you overspray the miniature. And by this, I mean you've applied too much spray paint when you're undercoating it. And well, this is a really common mistake to happen when you're starting out in the hobby, but to be honest, it can happen to anyone. And sometimes the spray paint can go a little bit weird for all sorts of reasons. For example, the weather might cause it to act strangely, it might go blotchy or grainy or something like that. Or indeed, you might even have some old secondhand miniatures that you want to strip the paint off and start painting them again, and this will work for those as well. And to do it, what you need to do is to strip the paint. And there's lots of things you can get out there that are great for this, but you've got to be careful because sometimes they might cause some damage to the model as well. For example, something I've used a lot is acetone-free nail varnish remover, which is fantastic at removing paint very quickly, but it's only good for metal miniatures because it will damage plastic and resin ones, so it's a bit limited as to what you can use it on. So what you need to do first of all is just check around, see what things are available to you and what you can get a hold of. That's great for it, and there are some specific products that are designed for it. For example, I've got one just here, which is what we're going to use in this video. This is from AK Interactive. This is their paint stripper. This stuff's great because it works on metal, resin and plastic as well, and we're going to use it on a plastic miniature in this example because I've got Space Marine here who has been, well, bravely sacrificed for the cause just here because I put on a lot of spray paint onto him, and you can see it's gone all kind of cracked in the corners around there, around that shoulder plate. It doesn't look very nice, so we want to get it off and start afresh. So to do this, what you need to do is to get some things together, and I've got them just here. What I've got is the paint stripper, which I poured into this glass. Now, this of course means I'm using quite a lot of it in one go, so this is great if you're doing like a squad and you want to strip whole models. You can just paint it onto specific areas if you want to remove little bits of paint, but if you're doing a number of miniatures, this is the way to go. So I've got that ready. I've also got some water here, which is soapy, so I'll put in some dishwasher into there, so it's going to be good for cleaning the model later on. I also have two toothbrushes. I've got this one, which I'm going to be using to remove the paint, and this one to help out with the cleaning later on. And so what we need to do is just get the miniature, submerge it into the stripper, and then leave it for 3 minutes. It's been 3 minutes and I've now put on a glove to protect my hand because what we need to do now is fish the miniature out of there. So you just need to dig them out. There we go. And then make sure you get some tissue down because this bit's a little bit messy. You get your toothbrush that's there for stripping the paint, and all you do is just start scrubbing and you'll see the paint starts coming away straight away. Now it might stain the plastic still, but what matters is that you get down to that sharp detail. So just keep on going until it reveals itself. If whilst doing this you find the paint starts to get a little bit tacky again, don't worry about it, just pop it back in the stripper for another 30 seconds and then carry on until you're happy. I've been scrubbing for a few minutes and you can see whilst that plastic is indeed a little bit stained, the detail is now sharp once again. So what we need to do is to clean it because there is still some of that stripper on there. So we need to wash the figure, and that's what this other liquid's for. This is the soapy water. All you got to do is just drop your miniature into there and then using your other toothbrush to swirl it around just to make sure it's properly submerged, and then it's just a matter of scrubbing it once more. So like before, just need to fish him back out. And then once again, just start scrubbing with the clean brush. And once done this, just a matter of getting some tissue and drying your miniature, and then you're good to go. And there we are, the model's now been completely dried and it's ready to be repainted. And whilst in some places it might look a little bit dusty or rough, for example on that knee there, it does feel completely smooth to the touch, which means as soon as the new primer's put on there, you won't even notice. Now, of course, the main way to fix this kind of thing is prevention and avoid it happening in the first place. And so with that in mind, always make sure you read the instructions on the spray can that you're going to be using and remember the key points. And those are to make sure that you shake the can for at least 2 minutes before you use it, to make sure you hold it 30 centimeters away from the miniature that you're spraying, and to make sure that you apply it in short bursts. Another common mistake I often see, and in fact I've seen this an awful lot, especially when doing seminars and things, is people not putting enough wash onto details to get that definition. Now the reason for this makes complete sense, because people first of all don't want to waste any paint, so they're trying to minimise how much they're using, but in addition they don't want to get it to clog up detail or anything like that. So the thin coats thing. And washes though, it doesn't quite apply in the same way. You want to get enough on there that you get that definition, but not so much that you clog the detail, so you can see why this will lead people to not putting on enough. Now I've got a space marine here where I've got this as an example on his bolt rifle just here, and essentially what's happened is, I'll just use a little bit of water to illustrate what's happening here. People just get a small amount on there, they start applying it, and you can see the sort of shine I get from the water just there. It dries really quickly, so there's not enough time to get it across the entire thing, thereby establishing an even coat across it and get the definition standing out and adjusting as you need to before it starts to dry, which means you get an uneven finish on things. In some places, such as around the barrel of the gun, there's hardly anything, so you can see there's no definition, whereas on the back, it's kind of dried really flat. So again, there's no real definition. However, on the magazine down here, there's a blotch at the bottom, so it's a bit too dark and it's not even. It basically just looks a little bit messy. It's not very nice. So all you need to do is to fix that up. And luckily doing so is really, really simple because we've already got those base coats on there. What we need to do is just re-establish those base coats by basically reapplying them. But because the colour's already there, you just need one thin coat. So for example, if we start with Mephiston Red, which I've got just here, all you need to do is get a small amount of this ready. So I'll just get a little bit onto my palette. Make sure it's really thin with some mortar, so get a touch there, get nice and thin there like that. And all you do is just paint this back over those red areas. And because the wash is so thin there anyway, you're not going to see it showing through. So all you got to do is look for those red areas, just reapply them, and the same on the silver and the gold as well. I finished neatening up all those base colours, and so now ready to reapply the wash to it. And what we need to do is consider how big an area that we're going to be applying the wash to make sure that we apply the correct amount and use the right brush for it. Because depending on how big the area is, you should pick a brush that's appropriate to it. So for an entire miniature, for example, you want to go for something really large, like one of Citadel's medium wash brushes. In the case of this bolt rifle though, I want a kind of medium-sized brush, so I'm going to use a regiment brush from the Army Painter. And I've got some Nuln oil here that I'm going to be washing over the gun, and with this I'm going to be using a palette. Now you don't have to use a palette for this. If you're still fairly new to the hobby, it's a good idea to do so because you can clearly see how much paint you've got on your brush. It's a bit tricky to see it when it's inside the pot, but it's really up to you what you go for here. I've got a good puddle worked out, and I'm just going to load up with some of this. So I've got a fair amount of my brush there. And what I'm going to do is pick a starting point on the gun that's far away from details I want to avoid. So in the case of a bolt rifle like this, I'm looking at this kind of area here away from that hand. And the idea here is once you start applying it, to get it all across the weapon as quickly and as efficiently as you can. So really blob it on there like that. Don't worry about it being too much, just keep moving it around like that. And you can see as I go, it settles nicely and I'm able to get it all the way across quick enough so that it's not started to dry yet. So this way I'm able to see how it's behaving, and I can adjust as I go. So keep getting it all the way across there down to that hand. You'll notice as well, because I started up there, when I get closely to the details, there's far less paint to control, which means I've got much more accuracy about avoiding those areas. We also need to make sure that we get the back of the rifle too. So again, a fresh amount at the top there, and start moving it around, get it all the way across there. And there we go. So you can see already I'm getting a much better result. It's much more even, getting much more definition. It's much cleaner as well. Now, because it's still wet, I can see how it's behaving, and I can see it's got a little bit too much just there where the finger is. So what I'm going to do, make sure I haven't got any paint on my brush, just really like get rid of the excess off and some tissue, and you can just kind of poke it at these areas to absorb away the excess paint. Then just put it on some tissue to get rid of it. Same thing's happening just here. You can see as it's settling, more and more is appearing just there across those shells. So I'm just going to touch my brush to that, just soak away that excess there like that, just adjust it as I need to, then use the tissue to get rid of the excess. And there we go. I'm getting a much better result. That wash is now completely dry, and you can see the result is much, much better. It's far more even across all the flat areas, and there's far more definition in all the recesses too, giving a much nicer result. Now, once again, I can totally see why people tend to put on too little wash into these things, because they're trying to avoid using much paint, so they save some, but also they want to make sure they don't clog any detail. But as you've seen, you need to make sure that you put on the right amount so you can manipulate it around and get it into the right places before it dries. But also, you don't want to put on loads and loads and loads so that it doesn't clog up any detail. And speaking of clogging up loads of detail, that brings us on to part 3. So we've just looked at what happens if you don't put enough wash into a detail, but what happens if you put on too much and how do you fix that? And well, this kind of thing is much more common when you're applying large quantities of wash to a model, so covering large details like cloaks and things, or even the entire miniature. And it's because this paint is quite runny. When you put a lot of it on, what happens is it tends to run towards areas and pools in them. So like water really, creating puddles, and you need to watch out for this kind of thing. Now for the example we're going to use here, what I've got is the champion from some Myrmidonish Painbringers. I'm going to use his cloak just here. That's a great example of where this thing kind of happens often, particularly in corners such as down there. But it's worth noting it's any parts that hang down on details. So for example, the points on the bottom of his shield just there are a great example of where this would happen. Same with that little point there on the bottom of his sword. But we painted this cloak purple, this is Phoenician purple, and what I'm going to do is apply some Nuln oil to it using a medium shade brush from Citadel so I can get lots on at once. And you can see I'm really putting it on straight away, it's running down. But I'm going to stick with it, apply it all over, and then we'll let it start to dry. It's been about 15 minutes now and you can see the cloak is drying, but these lumps at the bottom, there's so much wash there that they feel very much wet. Now, if this is happening at this stage, you notice it like this, to fix it, what you need to do is remove away the excess paint, and it's going to leave a bit of a mark. So what I'm going to do is do it on this one just here. Get a clean brush, I've got my regiment brush for this, and all I'm going to do is just use it just to soak away some of that paint. So just get some of it loaded up on there, and some tissue, just wipe away the excess, get a little bit more. And there we go. Now you'll notice what it leaves behind is actually that original purple just there, and it leaves a kind of ring around it of where the wash is versus where I've taken it away. Now don't worry about that, we will clean that up later on, but doing this avoids having that lump there. Now for the other ones, we're going to leave them like that so you can see what happens when it's left to dry this way, but ideally you want to remove the excess paint there like that. The wash is now completely dry and you can see it's behaved a little bit weirdly, partially going ever so slightly shiny because of the quantity of it, but you can see over here it's really caked in the recess and there as well. Whereas the one we wiped away, we've got a bit of a ring now where it's darker around the outside and actually lighter in the deeper recess. Now to fix both of these, first of all what we need to do is, well, not fret about it and just move on to the next step, which is to layer that cloak to re-establish the mid-tone, and from here we can then work into fixing those errors. So what we need to do is return to Phoenician purple, which I'm going to be applying using my regiment brush. And with this, what I'm looking to do is to paint it onto the raised areas. So just make sure it's nicely thinned down and then apply it to those parts. So in this case, even though it's all very lumpy around there, I'm just going to look for that recess and avoid it and just apply this colour on either side. So going along there and along there. I've finished that layering, so now what we can do is go back to neatening up that shading, and to do this what we're going to do is shade it manually, so over the top of the areas we just got there. And what you need to do is to go to your mid-tone, so Phoenician purple in this case, but then mix it with a darker colour that's appropriate to the wash that you used. And in this case, because I used a black wash, that means a black paint, so I'm going to be using some matte black from the Army Painter for this. And I've already got some on my palette just there, and what I'm going to do is mix it with some Phoenician purple to make a really dark purple. So get some of that there. Start mixing them together in the middle and just create a really dark version of the colour there, like that. Then make sure it's nicely thinned down as ever. And then using this, what we need to do is paint it directly into the recesses to control exactly where this is going to go. We can't just reapply wash to the part that we washed away because you'll never quite get it to match up with the areas you've got around it, that kind of ring that's there. So instead we just paint this directly into this recess part like that, just to help control where it's going to go. For the other one, we paint it over the top so it sort of obscures that shininess and just helps hide it amongst the rest of the robes. And with that done, you can see the controlled shading really helps rectify the problem. Now it is a bit noticeable, especially on the one where it was really lumpy down there because of that slight texture it's got to it, but it's not that noticeable. Once you do some highlights over there, that'll just disappear. But there are times when you can't really do that because the detail is so pronounced that the gunked up wash really does show. And that's the case with this Space Marine we've got just here. Where you can see in his bolt rifle, we've let it collect around the muzzle of the gun just there, and it's really gummed up all that detail. So we need to remove some of that. Now in this case, the only thing you can do about something like this is to use some of that paint stripper once again, and that's what we're going to do, only applied in a much more localized and controlled fashion. And to do this, what you should do is get hold of an old brush, and I've got here an old regiment brush I've had for a long time. I've got some of the stripper poured into the cap just here, and I've got some soapy water once again. And what I'm going to do, it's like the previous time we used it, is apply it, but rather than dunking the model this time, I'm just going to paint this over the part we want to remove. So just get some of that on the brush. Don't need loads and loads. All I'm going to do is just start painting it around this area just here, and you'll see very quickly it starts to eat into that paint and remove it. And it's essentially just a matter of doing this, removing some of that paint until you've got rid of the excess wash, and then just washing this small area with that soapy water. Now once that's done, it's just a matter of reapplying the base coat to this area and then washing it once again in a more controlled fashion. And for a small area like this, I wouldn't even bother undercoating it, just painting straight over this with the base paints will be just fine. I've reapplied those base coats and the wash on the end of the gun as well, and well, there you go. It's in a much more controlled fashion this time, and you wouldn't even know there was a problem there in the first place. And the gun is now ready for some layering and some highlighting. So as you've seen, the key to fixing this is to look out for the problem as it happens and move away the excess paint. But if it does happen, don't worry about it because it's not the end of the world. The next common mistake we're going to take a look at is making mistakes when you're applying highlights, particularly edge highlights to miniatures. And this technique is notorious for being a little bit tricky to do because of the steady hand required, but don't worry, it's not anywhere near as difficult as it first of all looks. And to do it, really the key is to minimize any mistakes being made in the first place by getting the paint thinned down correctly. So that's what we're going to start off with just here. We're going to be doing it on an ultramarine, so the highlight I'm going to use is some Calgar blue. And to get this ready, I'm using a small airbrush from Citadel just here, which I picked because it's got a nice fine point, so it helps out with those highlights. But what you need to do is to get some of this paint onto your palette, and I definitely recommend a wet palette for this because it keeps the paint wet and at the consistency you want for longer. It's really comfortable when you're doing this kind of thing. And what you should do is get your brush clean and then start bringing in some water to the mix. So I put it next to it on the palette and start mixing it in like this, because this way I can control how thick or how thin the paint's going to be by just bringing in a bit more of that pigment. And essentially what you're looking for is the sweet spot where the paint's thin enough that it applies easily from your brush, but not so thin that it runs out of control. Now it takes a bit of time and experience to get used to exactly what point you want to bring each colour to, and each colour is slightly different for it, but Calgar Blue is a great one to learn this from because it's a really lovely paint. It applies really nicely. And what you're looking for is to get it to about this sort of consistency here, then get rid of the excess off your brush and just test it on the palette by painting some lines and just see how long you can go for. And if the lines keep on applying, then you know you've got it thinned down just right, and you can see they keep on going and going here, so this is good. I'm going to go along with that. So it's a matter of just loading up your brush, making sure there isn't loads of it on there. So you see I am loading it, but there's not a massive amount in that brush, and then we can start applying it. So all you do is just very carefully start looking for the edges and just brushing across them. So using the side of the brush, for example, on this part here, you just skim along and get that fine line catching like that, and then along there, and along this part just here, and you just turn the model so you're comfortable. Now as you're doing this, mistakes will happen. So for example, if you're going along here, you might just make a bit of a splodge like that. If you're quick, you can wipe it away with your finger, but you might not notice it, in which case you might leave like a little lump there like that. Or some cases when you turn the model to use the tip of your brush for some of these tricky to reach areas, such as just here, when you paint the line along here, it might go quite thick. So for example, it might splodge like that, it might look really rough, it might run into some of that recess just there. All kinds of things can go wrong as you're doing it. So don't worry about it. If that does happen, just carry on, because it's very easy to get hung up on things like that and basically just keep on fixing them and doing them again and never actually finishing the detail. So what I'd recommend you do is carry on applying Calgar Blue to all the areas on the miniature for the blue armour, finishing that highlight, then returning to fix these things up. Now to fix them, what you need to do is return to the mid-tone and also the shade that you use to shade the armour. So in this case, that's going to be some Macragge Blue and some Norn Oil. And we'll start with Macragge Blue, and with this, all you got to do is just get a small amount of this ready. So there we go, nicely thinned down, because remember we thinned down those highlights, which means they're nice and translucent, so we don't need this to be really, really strong. Get it to about that point there, and then what you do is reapply it over the flat of the armour, kind of going up over that blotchy area. So for example, you can see the blotches just along there. I'm going to start this sort of distance from the armour and then just kind of go back and forth, sort of wiping like that, almost erasing it, going close to the edge and then stopping there. So once again, a bit further up, back and forth, just bringing it up to that edge. And there we go, a nice neat edge highlight. Now same will be true on this part just here. Again, approach it from the side, just get your brush flat across there and go back and forth. Just bringing it up close to that edge, and there you go, easily done. Now for the recess on the other hand, for that what we need to do is return to the wash, so in this case it's going to be back to Norn Oil, and with this you just need to get a very small amount of it ready on your brush, so just a very small amount just there. I'm just going to get it from the lip of the pot. There we go, get rid of the excess, and using this, all you need to do is just dot it back into that recess, so just approach very carefully and just dot it in there like that, run it along, and there you go. Problem solved. So as you see, it's really easy to fix these things. It's certainly nothing to hung up about. All you got to do is, well, just keep on going with that colour for the highlight, get it across the whole area and then go back and fix things up, because then you'll feel really good about having finished that part and it look nice and neat as well. The next thing we're going to take a look at is a very common mistake when it comes to painting in fine details. So for example, painting the eye lenses of a Space Marine, which is what we're going to be doing for the example just here, because when doing these fine details, it's very easy to lose control of the paint and get what we call a splodge on there. So a lump of paint, a splatter, that kind of thing. Now if this happens, you shouldn't worry about it. It's very easy to fix, but you need to be quick on your feet to be able to really mitigate it. And that's what we're going to do just here. I've got some matte white because we're going to go through the method that we'd normally do on Space Marines, which is to paint a line of white and then put a wash over it to give it a kind of glow effect. But starting with that white, go for a small brush. I'm using my small airbrush from Citadel just here. And with this, what I'm going to do is just get a small amount of it ready. So thin down with that paint. So like that. And then we can apply it to the eye. So as you're applying it, what might happen is you might have too much paint on your brush, or it might be too runny. Doesn't really matter. When you're putting it on, something like that might happen, and it might just sort of splodge all over the eye lens. Now, if that happens, don't worry about it. Quickly get another brush that's clean and some clean water. And what you do is just get a bit of this and just run it over that area like that. And you can see straight away what it does is activates all that white paint and gets it moving and removes it from the area. And it means we can then use the brush like a sponge just to soak away the excess there like that. Now, it might leave a few little white marks, but certainly nothing to worry about, because once this is all dry, we can easily come back to that and fix it up. I've left the model for a few minutes to let it dry completely, and then it's just a case of looking closely to see if there's any white residue left. And in this case, there's only a very small amount on the brow just in there, so that's all we have to fix up. But it's really going to vary from model to model depending on how quick you are and how much white that was there, and also whether you've done highlights yet or not. But whatever the case, just go back to the area that's got some white on and paint over it. So in this case, it's Macragge Blue. If any of it's gone into the recesses, then you'll want just a little bit of Nuln Oil, and it's just a case of just painting back over like that, fix it up. And there you go, you'd never even know the mistake had happened. So the trick is really just to make sure you've got some clean water and a second brush, and if it happens, just quickly wash away the mistake. The final mistake I want to talk about is what to do when dry brushing goes wrong, because it's very easy for this technique to leave behind some sort of dusty, streaky marks. And so that's what we're going to do just here. Once again, we're going to be using an ultramarine for our example. So the colour I'm going to be dry brushing on is Cronus Blue. I'm going to be doing it using a small dry brush from Citadel here. Now what's going to happen here is much more likely to happen with Citadel's dry paints than it is with other paints, because these are so pigment rich. So it's very easy for them to have some paint left in the bristles and leave behind some marks, but it can happen with anything. Now, I'm just going to get this ready in the usual way by just getting rid of some paint on a tissue, but it's often the case that you don't get rid of quite enough and start applying it to the model too early, in which case this kind of thing happens where we start getting sort of rough marks appearing on the flat of the armour there like that. Now, if that does happen, don't worry about it. All it means is that you've got too much paint on your brush, so just go back to your tissue and get rid of the excess. But what do you do about that? Well, this is actually a lot like when we were fixing up those edge highlights earlier on. All you've got to do is go back to the mid-tone of your armour. So in this case, that's going to be Macragge Blue. So I'm just going to go for a small airbrush to fix this up. And all you've got to do is get some on the palette like we did earlier on. Thin down as ever with that touch of water. And then all we're going to do is apply it to the flat of the panel. Now with this, you might need to do 2 coats because the dry paints are so pigment rich. They're very strong colours. But in this case, I think one's going to be enough. And like that previous step when we were fixing up the edge highlighting, just start a distance away and just kind of go back and forth like this, effectively erasing the mistake, going close to the edge. And there you go, you got that fixed up really easily. And the same is true in the other areas. So angle the model so you're nice and comfortable and just work up to those edges. So along there, for example, on this round part just there, just bring it up to the edge. And there you go. Problem solved, no issue whatsoever. So then when you're ready to go back to the dry brushing, just carry on as you were, but remember, just get rid of more of the paint off some tissue and you'll be good to go. But as you've seen, it's very easy to fix, nothing to worry about at all. So there you have it, some of the most common mistakes and how to fix them. Now the key thing to take away from this is when a mistake does happen, don't be disheartened. It happens to all of us, and as you've seen, fixing these things is no problem whatsoever. Anyway, have fun painting your miniatures, and we'll see you all again very soon.